Right, over to you.
Okay. Right, so as I said, I think we're under recording pre-improvement agriculture. I'm taking the beginning of the pre-improvement era from 1707, just as it's a handy number, not because I think that's when improvement began particularly. But the accepted opinion about Highland agriculture was that it was inefficient and the people were at worst lazy and stupid and at best unprepared to change. So if we go to picture 1, Roland, please. Thank you. Lovely Jim Bone aerial photograph. And I'll say more about this in a minute, but it just keeps you entertained. One of the go-to sources for the late 18th century is the old statistical accounts written in the 1790s, which generally have a description of the agriculture, the production, and the habits of the parishioners. Phrases such as reluctance to enclose or refusal to improve, etc., give the impression of ignorance and inability to change and improve on the part of the parishioners. So were the ministers who wrote the accounts writing from actual discussions with their parishioners and direct observation, or from the reports of their heritors, the landowners? Did they understand the annual cycle of planting, animal husbandry and shieling, or were they writing a politically correct version which guaranteed their position and bolstered the new improved methods being brought in by their superiors, the landowners? The late 18th century, when these documents were being written, was a time of major change throughout Britain and Europe, and also a period of frequent famine. Was it during a famine year when the weather was particularly harsh, with snow lying well into spring and early summer, when the descriptions of cattle being carried out of the byres because they were so weak became a current description? Did this happen as implied most years, or was it just when the weather was particularly severe? Other reports, such as those from the forfeited estates, were thorough in describing the need to modernize and improve. Definitely political, they may nonetheless have been accurate in their description of the state of the countryside just after 1745. But again, the commissioners were from a different area and would not have understood the delicate balance of a farming system in the north. These ideas continued well into the 20th century. Historic environments, Scotland, for example, rarely scheduled settlements, such as I'm talking about, until the 1970s, as they were not considered of national significance. In recent times, a much more considered understanding of the firm tune or the bale or whatever you want to call it was finally begun to emerge from the study of estate documents and landscapes, Dodgson, Piers Dixon, and David Taylor, for example. And if we go to the next slide, thank you, Roland. I've been recording Dalnamain in Strathconnaig near Dornoch. It appears on the Blaw map and also the Robert Gordon map slightly earlier, of 1654, and you can see it here circled in red. That's Dalnamain. The only other settlement on that strath, which goes from Torbal on the right to Dalnamain, that's Strathconnaig. And it appears, as I say, in 1654, so it was of sufficient significance at that point, and it was cleared in 1813 to make way for Torbal sheep run. So an example of a settlement with an agricultural history of at least 200 years. There are hut circles on the site as well. In 1806, it supported 10 tenants, possibly up to 40 people, possibly more. And if we use David Taylor's lowest stocking ratio, taking the rental and from that creating a ratio of how many cattle that would support. The whole settlement would support around 55 cattle, 60 sheep, sundry goats and horses, and sufficient poultry to supply the 10 hens to Dunrobin in 1806, which was included within the rent of £15, 15 shillings. So if we go to the next slide, thank you, Roland. There you are again. And you can see that this settlement has been changed quite radically. Take away, and I'm pointing at the screen, which is of no use to you whatsoever, so I'll get my cursor. And you can see the big, relatively modern sheep fanks there and the shepherd's house. But you can also see the rig and houses here and all sorts of buildings all around. Taylor proposed his stocking ratio for Badenoch, but says that other areas would have had a higher ratio. So, you know, for £1 rent, you will at least 2, possibly 3 cattle. As they had, other areas would have had better ground and better climate. Badenoch, of course, is landlocked and very mountainous in comparison to even Dalnamain, which is relatively close to the coast. If you go to the next slide, Roland, please. So you can see Dalnamain again circled in red, and this is Loch Fleet, just north of Dornoch. Today, Dalnamain supports possibly 60 sheep, and admittedly these are the bigger Cheviot sheep, but doesn't have any crops, and occasionally when the sheep are off the ground, there are some cattle grazed on it. Pre-1813, there would have been barley, oats, and later potatoes grown on the in-by land within the head dike, as seen on the aerial photograph, which I think I've got another one of. Next, please. There we go. This is Merrill's beautiful plan of the site. And again, the cursor's showing the enclosure and the house. And these are the pre-clearance houses scattered along. Rig, lots and lots of rig all the way up here as well. Yeah, the cultivation strips and small enclosures, lots of little enclosures, tatty pits here and here and here, and there's one just under my picture. And they would have grown kale in these little enclosures, possibly, and I am prepared to be shot down in flames on this one. This level of production was able to support the tenants and their families, but it required careful husbandry. Animals had to be taken off the in-by fields by May at the latest to graze beyond the head dike, and the head dike, you can see the edge of it just running along here, and it actually goes probably all the way up there. And that prevented the destruction of the crops as they began growing. Shielding grounds were essential, and the management of these is well described by...
And I don't know why we've suddenly lost your voice.
Oh, sorry. Right.
No, that's better.
Okay, I must have covered my mouth up. This level of production was able to support the tenant and their families, but required careful husbandry. Animals had to be taken off the in-by field by May, and shielding grounds were essential. And the management of these is well described by Albert Bill in his book, The Shieling, and David Taylor. So I won't go into that, but it had to be very sophisticated in order to succeed. The production of milk products was essential for the population, for food, but also as a rental produce. In Badenoch's Press Muckrach's rent in the early 1700s was 4 pints of butter, 46 cheeses, every 10th lamb, every 10th fleece, and 1 merk for every milk cow. Well, that's one taxman's rent for the year. 46 cheeses is a lot of milk. Rents were converted to cash rather than kind from 1712 in Badenoch. The money for them came from the sale of cattle. It was the size of the cattle production, and if we can go on to the next slide at any point, Roland, the size of the cattle production which made me seriously question some of the old ideas. For example, Taylor recounts the problem of overgrazing on the shealing grounds. And this is one of the shealing grounds, A9, just here going north-south, the pass of Dromochter, which I'm sure you all know very well. And this goes up. Now it's been given a Gaelic name, but Taylor always calls it Corridone, and that I think is the old name for it. And this is the aerial photograph of that ground. Looks very green. Okay, the overgrazing of the shealing grounds near Dalwhinnie, when there were more than 10,000, possibly up to 30,000 animals, cattle, grazing on and passing through a small area. So there wouldn't have been 30,000 cattle on this glen, but throughout this area, and certainly the majority of the cattle would have passed along the pass of Dromochter. It includes many cattle brought south from the Murray lowlands, so the coastal strip in Murray, and put onto the shealing for a limited period between June and September to finish, to gather a little extra weight prior to being taken south to the trysts at Falkirk and various other places. Tenants would have included their own cattle on the shealing, and the Murray cattle could have been purchased by the drovers, or the Murrayshire farmers may have rented the grass in the higher ground. This was a very commercial system and required a lot of very careful management. The old statistical account provides information as to the kind of cattle which were taken for sale at the tryst. Cattle, including females, were often between 5 and 8 years old when they were sold. These cattle had survived at least for 5 to 8 winters, and sometimes more. So they weren't all so weak from starvation. Each tenant involved in the sale of the cattle had an animal to sell, plus up to 5, possibly more, younger animals. And the parent of the animal for sale occasionally. They were supported on the shealing grounds in the summer and the farmstead in the winter. Assuming that due to bad weather and poor pasture, the females did not produce a calf every year, still means the cows produced some calves that survived through the winter and then became the next generation for sale or for breeding. Given the sheer numbers of cattle being taken to the tryst every year, and again, Taylor suggests that 100,000 cattle were sold over the year. The complexity of the the complexity of the shealing system, which supported the commercial side of the pre-improvement agricultural system, means that we should be recording shealing along with their associated settlements, rather than just a random and separate feature. This is difficult, as settlements often have several sets of shealing, some at a considerable distance, up to 18 miles and more. And even on the 1788 map of part of Strathcarnaig, the Torbal shealings are shown, and they are at least 8 kilometres away from the settlement. Excuse me. Unfortunately, the reason for the map means that the Dalnamain shealings are not on the map. They could have been nearer to the settlement or higher up the hill and off the map. And finally, if we go to the next picture, These are the home maps of Ascent. I'm sure Gordon will recognise them very well. Found on NLS. They're now, because of the scanning of all the Sutherland maps, they now have the notes that Home made to go with each map. And he describes, excuse me, for example, the use of enclosed shieldings. So they were enclosed with walls, and they were planted with corn. And by corn, I think they mean oats rather than barley, because they talk about corn and beer, so that they're talking about corn as oats and the barley separately. So they were planting some of these shieldings, and I think the Ned picture is probably a shielding, because it refers to shieldings in the title. And then if we go to the next picture, thank you, Roland, you can see, and if you've got, like I have, all the people on the right hand side of your screen, if you lift that up very slightly with your cursor, you can see a wonderful little man. And this is in one of the notes of Alderney, which you see the big picture that goes with the map in the middle. And you can see cattle, sheep, and goats, and deer in that. But this little man, and I will read the description, which is on the next slide. Thank you, Roland. The description would astonish a stranger as the manner of labouring their grounds, which they do by a machine called, being a crooked stick like the coulter of a plough. In this severe manner, their tillage is carried on. So Home didn't reckon much to their way of ploughing. And coming to the end now, but David Taylor writes, after describing some of the testimonies of the ordinary people of Badenoch, these depositions provided a social context that resonates with a positive tone, not the downtrodden, impoverished, or idle peasantry perceived by the outsider, not a populace complaining of its lot, but an articulate people, local worthies actively engaged in the annual cycle of securing their livelihood. Similarly, from an economic perspective, these accounts support the image of a vibrant cattle-based economy in which tacksman and, to some extent, tenant were exploiting their environment in a kind of communal transhumance. And we owe it to those people to record the archaeology as fully as we possibly can. Houses, enclosures, head dikes and shieldings to the best of our ability. And my question is, how do we do this recording and by that understand these changes in the agriculture of the Highlands? And are we going to then confirm the contemporary reports, or are we able to revise the accepted ideas with robust archaeological evidence? Thank you. I think there's another slide, but I think it's the wee man again. There he is. Thank you. I think that's me finished, Roland.
Yes, it is, Anne. Thank you so much. And now, yes.
There we are. That's just my question.
Yep.
Thank you, Anne. I'm just wondering, I just did a quick search on the internet earlier, well, the other day, and I think they have started to record it, have they not? There's something somewhere where they are starting to record it. I'm not sure if it's HER or what it is, but I'm just wondering if you've come across that, because you're asking how do we record it. So I think there is something in the works.
Yeah. I mean, they HS now, or HES, started scheduling in the 70s, and I have personally walked many of these settlements, some of which are extremely extensive. Quite often they don't have the shieldings included. And it's, I mean, Jonathan and Susan and Kathy and lots of people will have opinions about that, because you are putting a lot of pressure on a landscape if you do a landscape scheduling. It's a massive area. But I think that's something we can all discuss when we've heard what Kathy and Jonathan have said. I think if we kind of hang on to our questions towards the end and do it that way. But yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks, Annette, and I concur with Anne. Let's hold your comments and questions just a wee bit longer.
Yeah.
And hopefully Jonathan's there, and this is Jonathan's first slide.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. I don't think you need to look at my face. You can stare at Roland still. I've taken a slightly different tack to Anne. When Kathy and I got fingered, we slightly did our own thing. Now this picture of Garbeg is, I'm trying to say that the in most of NOSAS and other surveys, we look at surviving settlements as unitary landscapes. We're recognizing their palimpsests of multiple periods. Thus, we recognize roundhouse settlements and clearance cairns as prehistoric landscapes with possible contemporary field systems, like here at Garbeg. Next slide, please. And this is similarly Garbeg. I'm using again these excellent photographs of Jim Bone, but perhaps the detail is not coming out here. Does my cursor show on this, Roland?
No, Jonathan, it won't.
No, it won't. Yeah, I don't know how
but mine will if you direct me a bit.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't think it's really necessary. If you, I don't want to talk too long, so if you click on to the next one. Of the this is a rather nice Peter May map of Koyach showing Ullapool. And again, I'm not really wanting the detail on here, but when we're looking at the post-medieval period, we do fail to recognize the complexity we're looking at. The surviving map evidence, such as Peter May's map of Koyach of the Cromarty estate. Next slide. And this example from Inverness Archive of Achnabat, that's Loch Dun Telchaig at the bottom left. And this is a fairly typical estate map. These were all drawn up as part of the reorganization, and they were a particular period. Anne was talking about the commercial development, and I wanted to stress here the history of these settlements. What we were looking at in the 18th and 19th centuries are much more commercial farming systems, when improvements were happening well before the commissioners of the annexed estates. Next slide, please. So I wanted to emphasize the time depth that we have in these landscapes. And they do change through time. It was traditionally thought in the sort of 70s and before that these pre-clearance settlements were historic from the Iron Age, and we could trace back how people lived through the medieval period. But really, the very different pressures on people. Historic documents are scanty, but the work of historians like Dodgson do show there were a range of different factors affecting the decision of post-medieval farmers, and indeed medieval farmers. They had to pay rents to landlords, often in kind, and these changed through time and were later commuted to money payments. And this varied from estate to estate and farm to farm. So we have to dissect the elements of a settlement. Some farms were specialist, e.g. in Glenorchy, they had what were called bowhouses, where they used to store cattle from other farms before being sold onwards, or indeed from Merrill and other surveys in Strathconnell for the distilling sites, where the structure of the landscape is affected by what people were producing. And there was also a transition from clan chiefs wanting the surplus manpower on their lands to maintain their power, wanting more efficient production of surpluses as they transitioned to a market economy. Documents often only mention the principal tenants, but there were far more people in most townships as subtenants and cottagers and dependents, whether they were elderly or imposed military spongers under the practice of sawing, which all had to be accommodated on these lands. Thus, in Taree, a detailed rental of 1768 showed the average township with 6 tenants had 5 cottages and a total population of 49. Where do they all live? How often do we recognise the humbler dwellings? Life and politics in the medieval period and beyond into the 16th, 17th and 18th century were unstable. And for the ordinary clansman or peasant, life was precarious, leaving little to recognise on the ground. They could lose their rights to land from year to year, or have their stock stolen and house and crops burnt by a rival clan, as well as being killed in these raids. This meant substantial material goods and structures were in the hands of the upper strata, and few for the ordinary clansman. So little to show from excavation. And I would argue that for the ordinary man, creel houses were the typical dwelling. We look at the stone footings of the typical township and assume this is how they were living. And in our surveys, we very rarely recognize the creel houses. I can think about 3 sites I've surveyed where I've seen these simple sites. I now want to slip through a few slides of Jim Bones' pictures. So next slide, please. So Kathy is going to talk about agriculture. And this slide is showing the typical landscape with the clearance cairns in the middle and what seems to be 2 systems of rig and furrow. Next slide, please. Once again, a brilliant slide of Jim Bones. But again, we're looking at fairly sophisticated buildings on the right of the picture. These are long houses and substantial settlements. Were there other ones in this landscape previously? And next slide, please. This is up Rogart Way, Letticolas. And again, these really long houses, which I suspect are fairly late, and obviously the later sheepfold. And again, another slide, please. We come to Achinduric. You've got this rig, I think, so the rig on the top right is forestry, but it's possible that the stuff in the center of the picture is over the settlement. But if you look at the left of the picture and the heather next to the pylon, you've got a prehistoric landscape. and we need to dissect these landscapes quite carefully to identify what is continuing from the old and what's in the new, and how in fact the people in these medieval and post-medieval townships respect the earlier prehistoric ones. And my final slide. These Westwick in Tradwell, these big circles, are these remnant historic, or are these just enclosures relating to the settlement? We need to be better at dissecting these landscapes. I referred in the history to the work of Hodgson and Taylor. Taylor is very much speaking in the 18th century, but Hodgson has certainly pulled out some of the work in of the earlier period. And I'm sure Malcolm has some comments to make about using the historic documents to understand these landscapes. It's not enough to do the survey. We need to look at the documents to try and sort these out. And I now pass on to Kathy.
Hello?
Can you hear me, Kathy?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly.
Good. Shall I just start then? I've just lost your big screen. But I can manage, I think. So I'm taking a slightly different tack. Could we have the first picture? Just as an exercise, I decided to have a look at the actual practicalities of improving ground and cultivating ground. Given that Mother Nature didn't deliver ready-made agricultural ground, so the amount of land that could be brought into use depended partly on availability and on need, but also on technological ability. And the Duke of Sutherland's toothpick is possibly the pinnacle of land reclamation until quite recently. This is an example of throwing the money and the technology at the problem. And this machine cleared 3,000 acres of bog at a cost of £200,000 in the 1870s. According to Google, that's £23 million. Could I see the next picture now? But to go to completely the other end of the scale, cultivation in the Highlands, or just improvement of the ground for any reason, maybe began with very simple tools like the yard. And these cultivation marks in the picture here are sealed underneath a Bronze Age roundhouse, so they are very datable. But they're shallow, they're barely scraping the surface of the subsoil. Next picture, please. Now, if it were to be an ard creating those marks, the ard's other name is a scratch plough, and this is a reconstruction of it. It's an Iron Age tool. It's an early form of plough, although I think it had virtually no iron in it. So it would have been not much use on actually taking in rough ground. How much metal was actually available in the Highlands to make agricultural implements? The next picture. The picture at the top is of a large stone coarse stone tool that was found on St Kilda. There's a whole assemblage of large stone tools there, which were used for all the purposes that you would expect iron to be used if you had iron. And there's plenty of Iron Age settlements in England, or maybe in southern Scotland, which had the full range of iron farm implements. We've got sickles and ards and things. But there's a complete lack of surviving evidence archaeologically in the Highlands. This could be lack of preservation, or it may suggest a lack of iron. Next picture. So what tools would you have needed to create these vast landscapes of rigs? Once they've been made, they're easily enough worked year after year with whatever tools you have available. but the work involved in cutting and lifting the turfs to make them wasn't done with just an ard or a stone mattock. And anyone who's deturfed an archaeological site knows fine the value of a good sharp spade. Now there are Iron Age spades around. There's one in the British Museum. Norse settlers definitely were using something that you would call a spade. These were probably most likely just an iron shoe fitted onto a wooden paddle, but they would have had the ability to cut through turfs and roots and to withstand hitting stones under the surface. Next picture, please. So once you've actually won your land, there's a bit of a choice of tools. You could use the wooden plough or the cast crom. The wooden plough had very little iron in it. It was quite light and it could be carried about on a man's shoulders. But like the ard, it wouldn't have bitten very deep. Now the cast crom used as a foot plough was considered in the West Highlands and the islands to be a much better tool. Apparently 10 to 12 men could cultivate a whole acre in one day using the cast crom. The small arable patches in the photo behind, which was taken in Torridon, could have been cultivated either way. The use of the cast crom is probably very long-lived. There's a reference in about 1570 on the island of Harris to twice as much land being delved, i.e. dug, than tilled, i.e. ploughed. And so that we can infer that rig cultivation using the cast crom or a similar tool does go back into at least the late medieval period. Next picture. So the modern plough or the 19th century iron plough is a much heavier beast, which leaves deep, regularly spaced gouges into the subsoil, archaeologically, like in the picture here, and is capable of doing quite a bit of damage to an embedded boulder. Next picture. But however the land was prepared on an annual basis, whether it was by the plough or by the cast, actually clearing the land in the first place. So removal of stones into field clearance piles is one of our earliest indicators of land use and probably started with carrying stones no further than they had to be carried, i.e. into piles amongst the actual cleared ground, and only moving stones that could be shifted using the tools available or the person power available. Larger boulders were just left embedded into the subsoil and worked around, or they formed the basis of the field clearance. So these two examples I've got here show underneath they've moved some of the larger stones first, then maybe subsequent seasons they've added smaller and smaller stones as they've continued to improve the fields. Now apparently with the introduction of potatoes, even smaller stones would be gathered up because a potato-sized stone you didn't want to actually get into your potato sack. Next picture. But those, could have the next picture please. Those pesky large boulders just had to wait in the ground until iron bars were available to lever them out of the subsoil, and then they had to be split to get them out of the way. Splitting by burning is pretty inefficient and it uses up a huge amount of valuable fuel. So probably this wasn't carried out until strong iron drills, black powder or plug and feathers were available to split them. There's a site in Culloden here we'd excavated where what had obviously been quite a large boulder was just smashed into fragments by one of these methods, and then a large pit was dug to bury them. They didn't bother taking the fragments away, but generally those bits would have been taken and used in dry stone dikes. Next picture. I was given 5 minutes and 10 images, and this is image 10, which doesn't actually add to my gallop at all, because I have actually finished what I was going to say. So thank you very much.
Okay, so I've stopped sharing and I'll stop